together. Okay, is that all of us? Are we all comfortable? We've got tea? Good. Well, welcome everybody. Really nice to see so many people once again for this series, Hardwick lecture series on Hardwick's history. And the Hardwick lecture series, as you may or may not know, has been going for about a year now. And the original idea, which was a group of people in the estate came up with, was to showcase the skills and talents of different people living on the estate, you know, who we live around, those of us who live here and in the village, but we may not know, you know, about people's expertise or, interesting things that people on the estate have done. So we did a whole year of monthly lectures, and then this series is about Hardwick's history. So we had one about Hardwick's ancient history, Iron Age settlements, Roman settlements, about a month ago. This one is about Hardwick's modern history, kind of Victorian, medieval Victorian. And then the next one will be about Hardwick's very recent history, really about my dad, Sir Julian Rose's time on the estate and what unfolded in that period. So yeah, you're most welcome. Hope to see you. The next one, which is on 11th of May, so it's quite soon. That was based on when my dad was here. So first of all, a bit of housekeeping. The loos are outside, just out that door, and then turn right through the first green door. There's tea at the back. We're very, very grateful to Tolhurst Organic for the use of this space, which is the only kind of decent sized space we have on the estate for any events like this. And we really appreciate your donations because they go towards this, as well as covering our costs for putting the talks on. They go towards the space, which Tolly's put a lot of love into and we all benefit from. So yeah, please do give generously. So I'm going to kick off, and then I'm going to introduce Michael Redley, who's written the book The Real Mr. Toad. Some of you may have seen him speak 7 years ago now, when we first published a booklet about my great-great-grandfather, Mr. Toad. I'll introduce Michael in a minute. But first I wanted to give a little bit of prehistory for those who are interested in the area, really about the estate and Hardwick House in particular, before the Roses occupied it. So excuse me, I'm not a historian at all, and I've just put this together from things I found on the internet. So if I'm wrong, please correct me, and excuse me reading from a piece of paper. But I'm sure a lot of you probably know that the Domesday Manor of Hardwick, which was a manor on an enormous estate stretched to Wallingford, was originally owned by Wigod, the Thane of Wallingford, and was then dished out by William the Conqueror to someone called Robert de Oily on his marriage to Wigod's daughter Aldith. So at that time, that was a Norman conquest to divvy up of land. It was a huge, immense estate. And there is a register of a property on the site of Hardwick House in the Domesday Book, so there would have been some sort of farmhouse there at the time. And then in the 13th century, the house and grounds passed into the hands of a Norman French family called the de Hardwicks. And at that time, it was normal to name yourself after the place where you were from. So Hardwick is likely to have come from hard spring, or wick, or wick, or witch, or waich, were Celtic names for a spring. And apparently on Saxon maps of Whitchurch in the area, there's a spring, there are springs marked. So it would have been a hard spring. I don't know whether that means a very vigorous spring or very hard water, I don't know. Anyway, so the de Hardwicks would have named themselves after the spring, and that became the name of the area of the estate. And then in 1526 or 1527, the estate was purchased by Richard Lybbes I, who was a wealthy landowner and MP for Tavistock, whose descendants, the Lybbes and the Powys-Lybbes, would own Hardwick for almost 400 years. So what I find interesting about this is Hardwick, as we know it today, really, has only been owned by two families, by the Lybbes for 400 years and then by the Roses for the last 150 or so. And there's an assumption that Richard Lybbes would have demolished what was there, the farmhouse that was there, and then erected his own building on the site. And there is a well-known story that Queen Elizabeth I visited Hardwick on one of her sort of progresses around the kingdom. But there's no proof of that, although we still like to keep that oral history going in the family. So this, I think, is very interesting. In 2015, Oxfordshire Buildings Record, who are a fantastic voluntary organisation who come and date buildings, asked to come and date Hardwick House, and it was very interesting what they discovered. And I'm going to read a little bit from there. So what they do is they get up into the attics and they look at the construction. And they look at marks, so these assembly marks on the rafters, which they found, you can see some here and some here, in the attic of the house, will date because they use particular kinds of knife and particular marks, the joiners of the day, which can date them, and also the way the timber's sawn can also date it. And another thing which they've discovered, which can be used for dating, is these burn marks. So apparently burn marks were applied to wood in the 17th century, and the research, of course it's not completely understood, but the research into it suggests that it was about superstitions, either to ward off evil spirits or maybe as a kind of preventative medicine to prevent a bigger fire. If you marked it with fire, that would prevent fire. So amazing what you can discover from poking about in a house. There's 2 seats down here, people that have come in, if you would like a seat, or we can try and find more chairs upstairs if needed. Please don't be shy. So anyway, so what they discovered is that the first thing to be built would have been this block E, which is kind of the centre of the east side of the house, which faces east. And that's thought to have been built around 1530. So we're really talking, 16th century building there. And then in 1610, a little bit of upgrading. I lost a bit here, no I haven't. And then another wing built in about 1615. The south wing, which was attacked and demolished, or the south-facing end was attacked and demolished during the Civil War, which I'll go into, was then rebuilt in roughly 1660. And you can see when you look at the building of Hardwick House, I don't have a picture here, but I'll do on the next slide, that it's a much more modern construction. And now it has sash windows and it's been modernised again, but it's much more modern than the other half of the house. And then the Dower House, which is a separate building to the side, about 1700. So I just thought that's very interesting. And the Oxfordshire Building Record Art, amazing organisation. Next. Oh. Okay, so these are just some lovely old prints of Hardwick, 1825, and this is really only relevant to people who know the estate well. Probably a lot of you don't really know what Hardwick looks like, especially because it's not visible from this angle, from the footpath. But this is the courtyard. This was part of the original design. There was the courtyard between the Dower House and Hardwick House was infilled, and my grandmother always claimed that it was haunted. That it was haunted. So when she got permission to knock down an extension, which I'll show you now. So basically what I think I want to say is that there have been 2 big building periods, on the estate and in the house. One was obviously, when the Lybbes first bought Hardwick, they would put their mark on it. And then again, when my family bought the estate, they first rented the estate in around 1850 and then bought it in the late 1800s. They did Charles Rose did a huge amount of building, and he added this enormous extension on, these loggia. But in the 1960s, my grandmother decided it was ugly. It blocked out the view from the Dower House, and it was too big, so she had it knocked down. And at the same time, she knocked down that courtyard. I'm not sure how she got permission for that. She would have got permission for this because it wasn't original. But the courtyard, I'm not sure. Anyway, so they're long gone. I think that's interesting to see. So this would have been the original front of the house, the east side, because people would have predominantly been coming sort of from the London direction, and most houses had an easterly entrance. Maple Durham does as well. Later that shifted to a northern entrance into that side. And one of the striking things I think about old pictures of the area is the lack of trees. So many less trees than we have today, and I think the one after this illustrates it. So there was a fantastic, huge spread in Country Life magazine in 1906, all about the house, and we've got several copies of it at Hardwick. If we were giving this talk at Hardwick, I'd have put all the artefacts out so you could see. So, hang on to the next thing. So the Lybbes, okay, we're going over the place, back to that picture. The Lybbes, I'm interested in kind of what kind of a family they were. The first Richard Lybb was an MP, as I've mentioned. The second, they were all called Richard. The second Richard Lybb, his son, was the sewer to Queen Mary. The sewer was kind of a glorified butler, who, sort of a high up courtier, who was also responsible for tasting food. That was the sewer element, it was about making sure the food was fit for the Queen. But he also accompanied the Queen on hunting trips, and he was given one of her some gilded iron stirrups made to accommodate feet in armour, which the current Tim Lybb, who I'm still in touch with, who keeps a family history, still has this stirrup belonging to Queen Mary. So they were royalists basically. So then inevitably during the Civil War, Richard III, the third Richard, was providing Charles I with money to fund his part of this in the Civil War. So that there's evidence that in 1642 a declaration was sent from the King for Richard Lybb to raise £100,000 from his subjects in loans, £40 demanded in plate, touched plate at £55, untouched plate at £45. 7 days given to find it and give it to the High Sheriff, Sir Thomas Chamberlain, who was to pay it back. The King's signature was at the top of the paper. So, you know, he was a staunch royalist, and the demand ended. It was addressed to our trusty and well-beloved Richard Lybb. So in 1643, parliamentary troops from Reading sacked the house at Hardwick. It's believed that they came up the river in boats and would have pushed a cannon up the floodplain and then bombarded the southern side of the house, which was destroyed. And they had to flee, and all of his riches were taken away. And yes, I mentioned that. And then, okay, on to the next slide. Another point of interest, which many of you may know, is that when Charles I was kept at Caversham for a period when he was captured and imprisoned, he came to play bowls at Collins End. There was a bowling green attached to an inn there, which is now Holly Copse. So that was an inn, you know, a medieval inn at that time. Medieval. I'm not historian. Mr. Jesse, in his History of the Stuarts, says he, the king, frequently went to the bowling green at Collins End, Mr. Lybb Powys' possession. There was a small building for shelter and refreshment near. Mr. Powys has a picture at Hardwick of the old lady who lived in the house near, who used to wait on the king when he visited the green. This picture is now at Holly Copse. Now, I don't think Susie and Barry are here, but I wonder if the picture's still at Holly Copse. The bowling green is now an orchard. Very interesting, because the only flat space I can think of on Collins End is now the cherry orchard. So presumably that.
There's a bizarre bit on it. So
well, there we go.
Brought up a raised, exactly square area that no one could.
There we go. Could be it. That could be it. I can never make sense of it because I can never work out where was flat enough. But actually, that is the only
it's
field.
An absolute square.
So there we go. Yes, and then this fantastic where the sheep are. That's right, the community orchard up by the pump house. And I love this poem, which is at the moment, and it says here, Lord Augustus Fitzclarence, Rector of Maple Durham, gave to this inn years after a portrait sign of the king, copied from Van Dyck, under which the following lines by Mr. Jesse were inscribed. And this original, piece, which is from Holly Copse, is now in the entrance to Hardwick House. Stop, traveller, stop in yonder peaceful glade, his favourite game the royal martyr played. Here, stripped of honour, children, freedom, rank, he drank from the bowl and bowled for what he drank. Sought in a cheerful glass his cares to drown, and changed his guinea ere he lost his crown. I love it. I think that's absolutely blazoned into my memory because I've been looking at it since I was a kid. So yeah, fascinating with the history there. Oh, I did put Straw Hall in it. There we go. And yes, worth mentioning. So then the next kind of thing of interest is the diaries of Caroline Powys-Lybbes. And if any of you are interested, you can buy them. Caroline Powys-Lybbes in 1730 wrote detailed diaries of her life at Hardwick and the balls and the things she was attending, and it became quite popular. So she says in it, "We live at Hardwick, our father with us, in a large old house, about 12 rooms on a floor, with 4 staircases. The situation delightful on the declivity of a hill, the most beautiful woods behind, and fine views of the Thames, and rich meadows in front. Hardwick woods you may perhaps have heard of, as parties come so frequently to walk in them, and requested to drink tea in a cottage called Straw Hill, erected for that purpose in a delightful spot commanding a noble view of the Thames." So, as we know, Straw Hall was basically built at a similar time to the house. It's nearly 500 years old, built as a folly, single skin brick thick. I know because I lived there. It's amazing that it hasn't fallen down. It just amazes me that it lasted that long. But that was the idea of the time. You drink tea and experience what it was like to be a peasant, in a small little house looking at it. And there's another lovely poem by Dean Thomas Powys. He was another rector. Oh, hang on, half of it's missing. Never mind, because I know the rest of the poem. Hang on, how does it start? "Within this cot no polished marble shines, nor the rich product of Arabian mines. The glare of splendour and the toys of state resign unenvied to the proud and great. Whilst here recline those nobler scenes you view, which nature's bold, unguided pencil drew." And that's still inscribed above the entrance to Straw Hall. And so he was a poet, Dean Thomas Powys. He wrote some lovely things, and this one I also thought was very nice of Hardwick. "Nature, in my earliest youth, I vowed my constancy and truth. Wherein lie Hardwick's much loved shade, enamoured of her charms I strayed. And as I roved the woods among, her praise in lisping numbers sung. And what strikes me is how little has changed in a way, you know, the beauty of the woods and the magic of the place. I think I'm nearly ready to stop talking. Yes, when I spoke to Tim Libb about his family history, he said they were quite a scandalous family, constantly getting into financial troubles, putting the estate into the hands of lawyers for years on end. And they still remain very, very divided family over inheritance, unequal inheritance from Hardwick. So it just goes to show, part of another conversation, how toxic land ownership can be for families, and his family is another classic case in point. Needless to say, the Libbes inherited Hardwick when it stretched to Wallingford and Goring. They whittled it away down to, well, it still stretched to Goring when my great-great-grandfather bought it, and he whittled away another 2/3. Thank God. One last picture. That's just a lovely 1793 image of Hardwick and Maple Durham in the background. But again, two things like this picture. One, amazing lack of trees. Nice to see the sort of natural Thames. But also, where's this track that seems to go over the top of almost like Bowesdown Hillfort or the top of Beck Tithe? I'd be very surprised if there was ever a road there. Or maybe it's Park Hill, and anyway, it doesn't quite make sense to me where that road was. But yes, right, I shall stop talking. Oh no? Yeah, hang on. Here we go, yeah, okay. So I'll hand over to Michael now, Dr. Michael Redley, who wrote this fantastic book, The Who Owns the Toad. And he's a lecturer at Oxford Brookes. And that's what I have to say. I'll leave it to you to say more about yourself.
Okay, good evening everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Good, okay. Now, my little booklet, commissioned by the Rose family, to whom I'm eternally grateful, because it was the first piece of history I had ever had a go at writing. Actually, I didn't tell you this at the time.
You did.
But it was launched here at the house in the main house in 2016, and there are copies for sale at the back. I happen to have noticed. And anything I say will be but a pale replica of the joy you can get from purchasing a copy for yourself. As I said then, and still find today, around here you can imagine this larger-than-life figure of Sir Charles Rose, holding forth, bustling energetically about with his latest ambitious scheme for building something new on the estate or rescuing some aspect of the realm. And Hardwick was also my starting point for unpacking the rumoured, but in the event, rather unexpected actually, identity between Sir Charles Rose and that wonderful waterside creature, Mr. Toad, depicted by Kenneth Gray in his book for children, The Wind in the Willows. I'm sure you all know of it. If I talk for about 30 minutes with a few slides and deal with any questions, do ask them at the end. I'd like to start with the life of Charles Rose and his family and go on from that to consider how and why he seems a perfect fit for the character portrayed in Wind in the Willows. Does that sound okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So Sir Charles Rose is I think an intriguing figure. The more I got to know about him, the more perfectly he seemed to me to be a reflection of the time in which he lived. So much so that someone who read the booklet for me in draft and knows the period very well asked rather indignantly why she hadn't heard about him already. It was the late Victorian and Edwardian time, sometimes called the Age of Gold, when Britain was at the pinnacle of its imperial splendour, unrivalled militarily and with possessions across the globe. High society, the milieu of the wealthy, if not well-born, was for the fashionable few, and Hardwick House and its estate, remodelled and reshaped by Sir Charles with the wealth of that age, is an epitome of that world. And here it is at night.
Would you mind stepping back a little bit, and I'll press the button for you, because also we're filming and the camera won't be able to see
You're
the
filming?
screen.
You didn't tell me you were filming.
I didn't tell you that. I'm so sorry. For the BBC.
What should I do?
For our own.
Demand a fee.
Definitely. Okay.
All right. I shall have to
I'll
reach
press the
forward.
button. I'll press the button
You'll
for you.
All right. So here it is at night, top left here, as the carefully contrived scene from a fairy tale, festooned with Chinese lanterns hung over waterways created for the purpose, the playground of the rich, decorated for a party given by Charles and his wife Lily before the First World War. And this well-known picture, bottom left there, by a society artist, John Singer Sargent, made me wonder if he, Singer Sargent, might have been at the party. The picture is called, you may see, Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose. And Charles Rose's wife was Lily Rose. And the gondola she brought back from Venice, complete with a gondolier, bottom right here, is a reminder in a way of just how wealthy and privileged Sir Charles and his family were. But there was also a ghastly premonition at the time that this idyll wouldn't last and that a crash lay just around the corner. Economic rivals, the United States and Germany, were coming up fast, with its free trade policies enabling its markets to be accessed by its rivals while they sheltered behind tariff walls, made Britain seem to some to be its own worst enemy. And everywhere there were signs that the nation was falling behind in its education system, social provision, constitutional arrangements, economic competitiveness. And as we'll see, Charles also reflected that sense as a Liberal Member of Parliament supporting the programme called National Efficiency, including large-scale social reform and putting national defences in order. This was a traditional society then, very much on edge, nervous about its own identity, and in ways I'll have to explain further, out of this edgy public mood also expressed, you find the portrait of Mr. Toad in The Wind in the Willows. Now, Charles Rose was born in Montreal in Canada in 1847, within an expanding and expansionist British Empire to which he remained totally loyal throughout his life. As a banker, he owed his fortune to it. He roved the world as its agent. He's said to have crossed the Pacific twice, when it was common enough for people never to go more than a few miles from the place where they lived. And here are photographs in the family's collection from Charles's travels around the world. This one showing the harbour at Fremantle in southern Australia. The next one showing Honolulu, and the third one from the island of Samoa. Now, these places were then, to most people, simply exotic names on the edge of the known world. To actually have visited and photographed them, I think, shows just how kind of privileged in a way, but also adventurous and ambitious Charles Rose was. A man of huge energy, ambition and personal appetites, Charles was a merchant banker. The funds under his control, raised on international capital markets and funneled through London, built railways, docks, markets, mining operations in North and South America, India and Australia. A tiny percentage of each transaction fell to Charles Rose, but it was enough to build up a huge fortune. Charles also invested on his own account, and he put his personal wealth into the bricks, mortar and land of his own kingdom here at Hardwick, and in lavish and expensive leisure pursuits, which included the ownership of racehorses. Here he is with a bowler hat here, watching his Derby winner going past with the king standing here watching. The construction of real tennis courts. Yachts. Magnificent fleet of yachts he ultimately owned. And finally, perhaps also to mention the construction of real tennis courts, which brought him to the attention of a much wider public. This was the first one I think he built here at Hardwick. And then, again please, this is the court attached to his second home, not a good photograph, sorry, at Suffolk House in Newmarket. It's now back in use today after many years as a light engineering works. Somebody put a pit in the middle of the floor, but it's all been filled in, and a local real tennis club has got it back going again. Now, Hardwick was to be the centre for the family dynasty. Charles married Lily Maclean in 1871 at a fashionable parliamentary church in St Margaret's, Westminster. Her father was an eminent engineer and also a member of parliament. She was a talented amateur sculptress who exhibited at the Royal Exhibition, the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, and smaller London galleries in the 1880s and 1890s. Thank you. Heads she sculpted of 3 of her sons on a monument now hidden behind a curtain in Maple Durham Parish Church. There were 5 children of the marriage, 4 sons and a daughter, whom Charles hoped to establish at the pinnacle of British society.
It's not just hidden behind a curtain, it's been moved into the vestry.
Oh, has it?
Because it was obviously deemed too big and ugly and dominant to be in the chapel, so they shoved it in the back.
Right. Yes. It hasn't been moved again, has it?
I don't think so.
No, that's where it is. You can see the fire ladder going straight up the front of it. Now you get a glimpse of all this from Rose family letters during the coronation of George V in 1911. Frank Rose, the 3rd of the 4 sons, rode at the head of his squadron of the 10th Prince of Wales' own Hussars through the streets of London in the coronation procession. He was in the uniform of his regiment, on the left here, very grand. Charles and Lily were seated for the coronation ceremony in the section of Westminster Abbey reserved for the aristocracy. Charles had been made a baronet by Edward VII the previous year. Now, poor Frank had to leave his glasses behind. You couldn't ride in ceremonial parades as an officer in an elite cavalry regiment wearing specs. And on the right you see him with specs, so you can see he actually sort of did need them. So it was all a bit of a blur. And then suddenly, when the procession reached the heart of London's clubland, Frank saw his father standing at the window of the Turf Club on Piccadilly looking down on the parade, and their eyes briefly met. No one got to be even a junior officer in the Prince of Wales' own Hussars then, except on the personal recommendation of the sovereign. And the same was probably true of the Turf Club, which was described as probably the most exclusive club in London. And the Roses were emphatically part of the fabric of Edwardian society at its highest level. It was a pretty rapid rise in a way for the son of an economic migrant from Scotland to Canada, from Scotland to Canada, from Canada to Scotland in the previous generation. Wealth was of course important, also social positioning. Charles Rose and his brother were sent by his parents or their parents from Canada to Rugby School in 1859, crossing the Atlantic at the age of 12, and a generation later, his 4 sons, Charles Rose's 4 sons, went to Eton College. Charles's own parents were also important in shaping their children's lives in other ways. His father, John Rose, highly intelligent, socially adept, hard-working, a lawyer in Canada who went into politics there, contributed connections in the imperial and in the transatlantic worlds, as well as the belief that his children could be anything they wanted to be. John was right-hand man to the first federal Prime Minister of Canada, a man called John A. Macdonald, and the first finance minister of the Federation of Canada. He also helped to resolve American grievances against Britain, called the Alabama Claims, for the part Britain had played quietly supporting the South in the American Civil War. John moved his family to Britain in 1869, becoming the Rose in the Anglo-American Merchant Bank of Morton Rose. Charles replaced his father as the Rose partner of the bank at the young age of 29 in 1878. Then there was Charles's tough-minded but charmingly politically acute American mother, Charlotte. She had a huge steadying influence keeping her family together during their rapid rise in society. And there's a portrait of her in a stained glass window in St Nicholas Church at Rotherfield Grays, near Henley. John and Charlotte rented Grays Court, now owned by the National Trust, for a couple of years in the 1870s. And one of their children, Charles's sister Amy, in this stylish portrait, as a society person with a little lapdog, lost a young daughter called Beatrice to typhoid while they were living at Grays Court. And there's a persistent belief locally that Beatrice's real father was not Amy's husband, but the Prince of Wales, with whom she had a dalliance at Cannes. And who knows the truth of these things, but notice that could I have a thing? The two roses at the bottom of the window here, which is dedicated actually to John and to Charlotte jointly. Now the Beatrice episode emphasises another factor in the rise of the Roses, the proximity of the family to the future Edward VII. Here they are, please, on the Prince of Wales's visit to Canada as a young man in 1860. John Rose is on the left. You can see the Prince of Wales, the young man with a hat in the middle. John Rose was Minister of Public Works when the foundation stone of the new Parliament building in Ottawa, for which he was responsible, was laid by the Prince of Wales. On his arrival in Britain, John Rose was made Receiver General of the Duchy of Cornwall, effectively keeper of the future Edward VII's privy purse. The family is still in possession of his dispatch box. Other members of the Rose family also enjoyed royal favours. Brothers and sons secured appointments in the royal household and to elite regiments, and mothers and daughters were presented at court. Now, one other factor contributed to the rise of the Roses, as if we hadn't had enough already, which is Charles' connection with the turf and with flat racing. It was a time when the top of British politics and the monarchy were heavily into flat racing. Lord Rosebery, the Liberal Prime Minister, was only in office for a year in 1894, but in that 1 year he had 2 Derby winners, the second of which, could I have the next slide, was half-brother to one of the 2 key horses owned by Charles Rose. This one is Bonavista, the portrait which hangs, does it still hang, in the library at Hardwick? Charles had acquired Bonavista from Rosebery at an auction in 1890. He paid 1,250 guineas. That was 50 guineas over the reserve price, a price which Rosebery had set outrageously high to ensure that Bonavista remained his. Thereafter, Rosebery paid increased attention to Rose, not least when Bonavista started beating his own horses in the classic races, including the 2,000 guineas at Newmarket in 1892, and was tipped to win the Derby that year. Recognised as a successful race owner, Charles Rose became the Prince of Wales' racing partner and shared some of the glory. And when the Prince of Wales's horse, Persimmon, won the Derby amid wild, popular rejoicing in 1896, you might find Charles Rose somewhere in this contemporary artist's impression of the celebrations as the horse returned to the paddock. I suspect he's there somewhere. I wasn't able to find him, but I'm sure he is. And a second Rose horse, called Celine, was Bonavista's son. Celine also hangs, I think, in the library at Hardwick. In 1898, Celine started winning the classic flat races on a grand scale, which the following year included the Gold Cup at Ascot. At stud at Hardwick, Celine went on to sire no less than 4 subsequent Derby winners, a record only equalled by one other horse, including they included Polymethus, owned by the leading Liberal Lord Crewe, Cicero for Rosebery, and Moniru for Edward VII. Charles's ownership of these key horses at the centre of this prestigious breeding industry in Britain gave him a status and access to key figures which he would not otherwise have had. So that's the wealth, that's the status of the family, which I wanted to leave you in no doubt on. It's fabulous. It just is extraordinary, even by the standards of the day. But now, that's the wealth, but what of the personal cost of it all? In October 1899, the South African War began. This conflict between Boer and British settlers at the southern end of Africa, 2 groups of white people fighting to the death in front of a bewildered black population, is barely remembered today. But it was huge in its time. 500,000 men from Britain and around the world went to the war, 10,000 died, and many times that number were made invalids. Political and social ramifications of the war, both in Britain and South Africa, are still felt today. In the Rose papers, there are very original, detailed eyewitness accounts of several incidents in the Boer War. All 4 sons, Ernest, Bertram, Frank and Adrian, found their way there, and described their experiences in vivid letters home. Remarkably, the whole social group to which Charles's sons belonged, their friends from school, county society, the City of London, were drawn to the Boer War like moths to a candle. They got to the conflict by whatever means they could, driven, it seems, by a desire to prove themselves worthy through engaging in the traditional upper-class calling of arms. The family's photograph albums contain really remarkable images of daily life on campaign. Here are a couple more. Could we just have those? I think that's it, actually. But we included several more in the booklet at the back of the room if you want to see more. And if you belong to the Roses level in society, you were assumed to be able to lead men in war, whether you had any military training or experience or not. Bertrand Rose, Charles and Lily's second son, arrived at the bottom of a hill called Spierenkop at dawn on the 23rd of January 1900, just in time to attach himself to the back of a column, setting out to climb the hill to capture it. Only 10 days before this, he'd been studying the drills used by mounted infantry using matchsticks on board the ship from Britain. As the mist lifted at dawn the following morning, Bertram was on the top of Spierenkop for one of the most vicious battles of the war. Goodness knows how he came out of it alive. The body of his closest friend, who'd been with him on the boat, was identified only by a pair of binoculars, which were known to be his. Now, the two eldest Rose sons died in South Africa. Ernest, who'd left Eton at the age of 16 for a career as a professional soldier, was shot by a Boer marksman as he scouted out the land for his troops. A detailed account of his death was given by Winston Churchill, then a young reporter in a dispatch printed in a London newspaper. Thank you. After surviving Spierenkop, Bertram, who was being groomed to follow his father into the bank, died of enteric fever, typhoid, at a base hospital in Natal. They were buried close to the battlefields where they'd fought, and Charles and Lily visited the graves in South Africa within 6 months of their death. Those were some of the photographs in the family collection on that trip to the battlefields to see the sites. Actually, the bottom right one isn't. That's a historical photograph which somehow got in there.
Gruesome.
Really gruesome. Yeah. So, Charles and Lily were devastated, as any parents would be. Charles had taken a tentative step into a political career in Britain just as the war began. A campaign led by Lord Rosebery, a leading Liberal figure, for national efficiency at all levels in national life, became a kind of catchphrase of the Liberal opposition, and Charles joined Rosebery's campaign. Appropriately enough, he entered Parliament for the constituency of East Cambridgeshire, which contained the town of Newmarket, the centre of flat racing in Britain, obviously. Charles would very likely have become Liberal in any case, but without the deaths of his sons in South Africa, he would probably not have been so zealous in seeking fundamental changes to his adopted country. His stake in the war, lives laid down to dig the Conservative government, which had blundered into the war without adequate preparations, out of a hole of its own making, meant that he had a stake. And when Charles said on the hustings that the Conservative politicians were criminally negligent, the opposition, the government in power, he was considered, even by his political opponents, to have cause to know. Charles won his East Cambridgeshire seat for the first time in 1903, and he held it for nearly 10 years. Here he is at the declaration of the results of the general election in 1910, which he had won with a further increase in his majority. Now, in politics, Charles moved from being a pillar of the plutocratic establishment to a radical. Could I please have the next one? He supported the Liberal government, its plans for the taxation of land and the profits of the city, and as this extract from one of his electoral addresses shows, to curtail the power of the House of Lords. He was an advocate of what was called New Liberalism, which for the first time provided old age pensions and unemployment benefits for working class people. There was no doubt about the genuineness of his beliefs. Twice a year he toured the villages of his constituency, meeting ordinary people, speaking to them in draughty halls and standing on carts in their farmyards. He bought land for the creation of a small holding scheme enabling landless labourers in his constituency to make a fresh start. They cheered him to the echo and returned him repeatedly to Parliament. Here was a rich man who took the trouble to listen to the poor and do what he could to improve their lot. Now, Charles was merely a backbench MP, but actually he had more influence than this implies. As one of the few members on the Liberal side with technical knowledge in financial matters, he was frequently consulted by their front benches, including Henry Asquith, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. There is correspondence with all of these men in the family papers on how to manage the nation's money. He'd acquired an interest in motoring and also became chairman of the Royal Automobile Club at a time when the motor car was struggling for recognition as a force in the land. Charles is credited with having come up with the idea of the road fund licence. You might love him for that, which was included in Lloyd George's People's Budget of 1910, a tax on motoring, the proceeds of which were dedicated to the improvement of the nation's roads. He was then appointed to the official road board, the government body which began the work of converting roads which had evolved over centuries to meet the needs of horse-drawn transport so that they could cope with the car and the lorry. From dusty tracks in summer and quagmires in winter, with a system of paved major and minor roads with the kinks and sharp corners taken out of them, which we have today. Charles Rose died at the age of 66 in 1913. He took a flight in an aeroplane and he collapsed on the car journey back from the airfield to London. The coroner said that his death showed that, I quote, aeroplaning was not a suitable occupation for people getting on in age. And that, again I quote, flying should be left to the young, the vigorous and the robust. Charles had become chairman of the Royal Aeronautical Club the year before, and it was he who secured the club's royal patronage. He thought he ought to try flying out, and his sense of adventure was on display when he talked enthusiastically to friends and colleagues on the airfield at Hendon. This is the type of aircraft he flew in, showing that he really was up for adventure, I would say. His funeral took place at the church at Maple Durham, close to Hardwick, on the 22nd of April 1913. It says on the monument in the churchyard that he died from the effects of an aeroplane flight. Now, the story of what may really have caused his death, the stresses of his planned sale of Hardwick, and his imminent departure to California with a mistress to start a new life, I think I'm going to leave that for now, although you can read all about it in the book. And I'd just like to end with a little bit about how all this fits in with the wind and the willows. Now, you'll remember that Mr. Toad is a flibbity-gibbet. He's always taking up the latest fashion and then dropping it when something more attractive comes along. You'll perhaps remember the episode when Ratty and Mole set out with Toad in his horse-drawn caravan, his latest obsession, which is overtaken by a fast motor car. The poop-poop rang with a brazen shout in their ears. They had a moment's glimpse of the interior of glittering plate glass and rich Morocco and the magnificent motor car, immense, breath-snatching, passionate with its pilot, tense and hugging his wheel, possessed all earth and air for a fraction of a second, flung an enveloping cloud of dust that blinded and enwrapped them utterly, and then dwindled to a speck in the far distance. And the terrified horse rears up and the caravan ends up on its side in the ditch. Toad is found by Ratty, sitting in the middle of the road, his feet out in front, staring dreamily at the dust cloud disappearing on the horizon. He breathed shortly, the text goes. His face wore a placid, satisfied expression, and at intervals he faintly murmured, poop, poop. Toad had found his new obsession. What dust clouds shall spring up behind me as I speed on my reckless way? What carts I shall fling carelessly into the ditch in the wake of my magnificent onset, said said Toad in the book. Now, as I've already mentioned, Charles was an early adopter of the motor car. Here he is in his own magnificent Mercedes with his daughter Muriel and chauffeur. In a history of the Royal Automobile Club, of which, as I said, he was president, he is depicted toad-like, wearing, I quote, wearing a balaclava helmet which concealed his flowing white locks and luxuriant moustache, hurling around the Berkshire lanes in his 16 horsepower Argyll. Charles was always picking up a new interest. The turf, real tennis, motoring, yachting, aviation, greyhound racing. He also dabbled in greyhound racing, and perhaps also land reform and radical politics generally. In a recent book on the turf, the author described Charles's toad-like whims in the owning of racehorses. But there is, I think, in the range of Charles's interests, something rather more interesting and special, which Kenneth Grahame's Mr. Toad definitely didn't have. On closer examination, we find that Charles strove for excellence, seeking to improve whatever he became involved with, whether in the sporting or the political world. He also had a fundamental concern with what we now call access. Through his governance of sports, he helped to open them up for wider use, whether motoring, flying, yachting or real tennis, which had previously been the preserve of an elite to which he belonged, or a clique indeed. If necessary, he put down his own money to make this happen. For example, in the case of real tennis, he built courts at his own expense, he held exhibition matches, he hired professionals who also promoted the sport, and he opened the facilities to local people and to nearby universities. In flat racing, he subsidised a magazine for the bloodstock industry and put up prize money for races which tested endurance and encouraged others to invest in strains which improved the British breed. The same story, incidentally, could be told about his ambitions in yacht racing. Now, to recognise the real Charles Rose in the figure of Mr. Toad, we must, I think, have a closer look both at Toad, Mr. Toad, but also at the author, Kenneth Grahame, because buried in the delightful self-contained world of anthropomorphic animals for children, there lurks another darker narrative aimed at their parents. When the book appeared, its publisher was sufficiently concerned at the way the book might be seen that they issued a statement denying that the book was, I quote, a political skit or a social satire. Grahame himself hinted that the materials of which his story was composed included, I quote, mental undergarments of all shapes and sizes, some of a rather private and intimate shape, he said. Grahame had been a loyal senior employee of the Bank of England at the heart of the financial world which Sir Charles also inhabited. He was the bank's secretary, charged with assuring the rectitude of the financial dealings of the City of London. Not surprisingly, for a man who'd worked himself up to such a position, Grahame was also a man of highly conservative temperament. He was a traditionalist who saw decay all around him in the contemporary world. Order was separated from chaos by what seemed to him nothing but a fragile sheet of glass. This was confirmed for him by a searing personal experience. In 1906, on behalf of the governor of the bank, he went to meet a visitor in the foyer in Threadneedle Street in the main bank building. The man pulled a revolver on him, intending to kill the man he believed to be the governor. 2 shots were fired, which fortunately missed. Then, 2 years later, Grahame was sacked from the bank for insulting one of the members of the court of the senior governing body. It was over an accusation he had made and refused to withdraw that the man was not a gentleman. We don't know what caused the charge to be made, but one can imagine a man of rigid mind seeing behaviour of which he did not approve coming straight out with the accusation, feeling so strongly about it that he paid no heed to the consequences. It was argued on his behalf that his life had only recently been on the line for the bank, but the complainant refused to withdraw and the dismissal was confirmed, and Graham was lucky to keep much of his pension. And it was in 1906, after the shooting incident, but while he was still working at the bank, that Graham began to write The Wind in the Willows. The Liberal Party, of which Charles Rose was a prominent backbench member, was elected to office on a radical platform just at the beginning of this period in 1906, and began implementing its progressive social and economic programme, threatening to sweep away many of the landmarks of the traditional hierarchical society in which Graham firmly believed. The Wind in the Willows appeared finally in October 1908, 4 months after Kenneth Graham left the bank. And in it, of course, the inhabitants of the riverbank are threatened by the stoats and the weasels of the wild wood, just as traditional society was threatened by the electoral landslide of 1906. While Mr. Toad is away on his adventures, and due to his negligence, the dark forces of the wild wood occupy Toad Hall. A public debate over the land scheme to settle poor farmers on small holdings in Cambridgeshire, which Sir Charles Rose had organised and partly financed, was at its height. He was seen as a prominent supporter of the redistributive ambitions of the Liberal government. As chairman of the RAC, he was also regarded as the foremost proponent of motoring. And for traditionally minded people like Graham, nothing so epitomised social decay as the motor car, used by the richest in society, but a deliberate affront to the traditional way with its slow pace of life and ordered way of doing things. So it's not clear, to be perfectly frank and level with you, whether Kenneth Graham knew Charles Rose personally, although it is quite likely that their paths have crossed. He as Secretary of the Bank of England and Charles Rose as a prominent city figure. After the First World War, Graham and his wife moved to Pangbourne, just across the river, of course, from Hardwick, and they were befriended by Charles's heirs living in Hardwick, and letters in Kenneth Graham's papers at the Bodleian Library in Oxford show that Daphne Rose, wife of Frank Rose, the third of Rose's soldier sons who died in the early months of the First World War, and her mother May, shared with Graham not altogether flattering confidences about Charles Rose. It seems from this that Graham may have known Hardwick in its glory days before the war. But there may actually be no connection to be made, and it doesn't much matter, because in any case, Charles Rose was the real Mr. Toad, in the simple and direct sense that he represented all that Kenneth Graham abhorred and put into the character of Mr. Toad, which he drew in The Wind in the Willows. So that's it. Thank you all very much indeed.
Well, do you want me to just, I just run through my bit, but if that's okay,
No,
then
sure.
questions. Yeah, another big thank you to Michael, because he's put so much time into this talk. After 7 years after writing the book, both of us had to kind of dredge up our memories again, so I really want to thank him. It's a fascinating. One more. Okay. We've already been sort of 45 minutes. I don't want to speak for much longer, but I do think it's very important to say what I want to say, which is that for me, coming from my background is in global solidarity and human rights work, and I've spent a lot of time in Africa and India with communities who are affected by mining, or what we would call neo-colonialism, a continuation of the colonial era. I used the research which Michael did into the origins of my family's wealth, which we had no idea about, and we didn't ask any questions. I think growing up, as kids, we used to play in the attic of Hardwick House, and there were lots of amazing Victorian artefacts from the colonies, presumably brought back by Charles, Lily, maybe their children, like a rug made of 9 leopards and opium pipes and Japanese kimonos, and we didn't sort of question it. But this book really revealed where all that came from, and ironically for me as an anti-mining activist, Charles's money was in mining railways, and so while it's fascinating and interesting to tell this history, the history of Charles Rose, and I do think he's a fascinating figure because he was a liberal, despite being so wealthy, he was a liberal and very pro taxation and redistribution of land. He didn't as far as we know, particularly challenged the ideas about how we treated people of colour, in the colonies. So that's what I want to just give a little bit of voice to. I'll come back to that. So I won't speak for long, but just suffice to say that one of the main, I think it was mentioned by Michael, but one of the main major developments which Charles Rose and more so his father John had a hand in was the development of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was a major railway, still exists in Canada, which cut right into the interior territories in order to extract the wealth. And of course, in that process, the indigenous people who occupied that land were, pushed off, and treaties were signed with them, and they were forced into reservations. And this is a picture of the Canadian Pacific Railway being built, going through a First Nations area. And it's somewhat interesting and ironic that one of the most affected areas was a Blackfoot reservation, now called Siksika. And the Blackfoot were quite kind of against the railway, opposed the railway, and they tore it down when it went through this particular territory. But in the end, treaties were signed, forcing them into a reservation, and most of them were wiped out through smallpox and starvation. As we know, this is what the Europeans hunted all the bison to basically extinction, so their food went, and they became more and more malnourished. And in an interesting twist of history, it's a Blackfoot elder who came to the UK to set up the Sweat Lodge, which is now on Hardwick Estate, run by Andy Jupp. In the Blackfoot tradition. So this indigenous people who my ancestors had a hand in, trying to sort of destroy their way of life. Their way of life has now come back to this land, which I find really fascinating. And then Australia. So Charles Rose had the richest gold mine in the Western Australian gold rush, called Ivanhoe Gold Corporation was one of his personal, put a lot of his personal money into it. And as, because I don't want to say all of this, so I'm skipping along. So a quote from Michael's book. His partners like Charles, he was a partner in a bank, so in this Victorian era, partners like Charles often put their personal cash in to kickstart investments. Therefore, in Michael Redley's words, to protect his own investments, the financial backer became the merchant supplying rail for construction, a director on the boards of the railroad company involved with day-to-day management, and the agent selling off land granted by government. So you couldn't say that they didn't know what was going on. They were there, very involved in every part of the process. And of course, in Western Australia, the gold rush, had a massive impact on the Aboriginal people who were living in that area. And again, their dingoes and kangaroo were hunted to extinction. They were forced into reservations. And what's interesting about both First Nations people and the Aborigines is that in both cases, when Europeans came or settled the areas in the early Victorian period, they described them as very strong, very tall, very healthy people. And into sort of early 1900s, they were described as genetically inferior, malnourished, because the physical state of them plummeted so much, and of course they were used for prostitution. And then again, when Michael mentioned the soldier sons, so Charles had 4 sons. He did have 4 sons, didn't he? 4 sons, 3 of which who tragically died quite young, and then Frank died after Charles's death in the First World War. And all those sons who were sent off to the Boer War, and then after those that survived the Boer War went off to colonial service in Nigeria and Sierra Leone and in India. And of course, in those places they were invading areas that belonged to indigenous people. And I have a little bit to say about that, which is... So this is Ernest, one of the surviving the sons that survived the Boer War. He volunteered for the special service with the Sierra Leone Frontier Force, fighting French and Germans in the scramble for Africa. From there he went on to what is now Nigeria in 1899 as an officer in the Royal Niger. Sorry, this is before the Boer War. As an officer in the Royal Niger Company Constabulary. Posted at Ibi on the River Benue, a tributary of the Niger, he led a number of punitive attacks against indigenous people. In one of the letters in the Hardwick trunk, he describes attacking an indigenous village whose inhabitants had previously killed a British soldier. He blew a hole in the town wall and was hit in the hand by a poison arrow. It was here that Ernest mapped a large area of the Benue River for the colonial company, led by the infamous George Goldie. Goldie's Royal Niger Company gained resources by bribing and signing treaties with indigenous people, the terms of which it then overtly flouted. This led to uprisings of indigenous people such as the Brass people in 1985, no, I don't think so, 1895, which was put down by the British Navy, who razed the town of Nembe, killing 300 people, alongside a smallpox epidemic which wiped out thousands more. For such actions, the Royal Niger Company gained a reputation in Britain for oppressive conduct. It may have been Ernest himself who in the late 1890s allegedly observed Ibby's Hausa traders marketing tin products, subsequently advising the colonial company to prospect for and ultimately find the vast tin deposits of the Jos Plateau. After the exploratory mapping was complete, the area was also land grabbed for cotton and palm oil plantations. So, you know, as we all know, this was the beginning of the Commonwealth and the extractive capitalism that we have today. And this map, you know, this was obviously a new territory being mapped by Ernest, and this amazing map is in the collection at Hardwick with this lovely image of, you know, a trip down a river. But, you know, these were the original maps that were being made, which were leading to the sort of the plunder of these areas, basically. And Ernest sent back. Oh no, hang on. Ernest sent back the map along with a whole box of loot, as he described it, from what's now Nigeria. So swords and arrows, which used to be on the wall of the billiards room, which is now knocked down in that extension, toed extension with the loggia. So they were once on the walls. They no longer seem to exist. And the last thing I want to say. So I could say more about that, but anyway, I've given you a flavour, but I just think it's very important to recognise the history that we don't speak about, which was the result of the wealth, you know, which was accrued. And this is a local, a bit of local politics, which I would love to have this printed and distributed locally. One of the things which Charles Rose became a speaker for was the abolition of the Whitchurch toll bridge. A relic of medievalism. Their abolition demanded, and that there's multiple articles in the scrapbooks about his. He did fail, but considering it was considered a relic of medievalism then, you know, nothing's changed. And he's talking about how it disproportionately affects poor people, and he got a huge movement behind him, and there were protests and everything, but didn't quite happen. I would like to print this off big and post it all over just to make the point that, you know, nothing's changed. So yeah, that's a sense of the realms of Toad. Now, I don't want to sort of, you know, create a downer on the previous presentation. Both histories are equally important, but I just think it's important to bring the light to both. So anyway, another huge thank you to Michael, and it'd be great to have any questions. Nick.
Hi Michael, thanks for the brilliant talk, and I've read the book, it's really,
Oh,
really
you
good
have?
as well. Yeah,
Oh,
so shout
star
out.
prize.
But yeah, thank you for that. Do you know what the family was doing in Scotland, or you know, by trade, but also what caused them, or John, to emigrate? And did it have anything to do with the Scottish clearances?
With the Scottish what?
The clearances.
Clearances?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I honestly don't think so. That's a very interesting question, and I'm afraid I've never looked back beyond the beginnings of the Rose family in Scotland. Why did they leave Scotland? I think they were townies. I don't think they were farming people. I think they were townsfolk living in Glasgow from memory. Yeah. One of the big cities, and economic prospects were not great, and there was an emigration scheme, and they went. And they had a really rough time to begin with, as the book recounts. But because they went into kind of completely undeveloped land, and they had a hell of a time sort of getting it into production. And there's some wonderful letters in the papers about all that, but I don't honestly think it had to do with the clearances. Actually,
the Roses were already a wealthy family, and I think there's links to Inverness-shire. They were living in County Nairn, because Rose of Kilrourke, it goes, but you know, I know a little bit about the history of it, so already wealthy. But I think another interesting thing is that John's wife Charlotte was Irish, wasn't she? And she
was American.
Oh, she was American. Yeah. Oh, I thought, well, she had some links to Ireland, didn't she?
Oh.
Because they were in support of the Irish she supported the Irish
Yeah.
struggle for independence or
I'm
whatever
so
was
sorry,
happening at the
You may
time.
be right. Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
she was of different stock, I think, and
That's-
anyway,
I mean, but
that's all I
Charles
can remember.
fought against the Fenians, didn't he?
He did.
Yes.
Yes, he did.
That must have been an awful.
Yeah, that was a wonderful episode. He came under. There was one of the a Fenian raid into Canada from the United States territory, and the United States government had declared they weren't going to let this sort of thing happen, but it was an enormous long frontier, so it was impossible to police it. And Charles was part of the military unit that was tracking these Fenian invasions, and it was the only military service he actually saw. I think very briefly a gun was fired around him, but on the strength of that he developed a handlebar moustache, and he kind of went, his soldier sons sort of were living up to his tradition of military greatness ever since. But actually, when you look at it closely, there wasn't all that much of it, to be honest. So there was just this very brief non-battle on the frontiers with the United States.
Cool, thank you.
Were there any other equivalent Toad-like landowners kind of entering the Liberal movement? Was he a bit of a one-off?
I think he was a bit of a one-off, to be honest. On this spectacular scale of being so wealthy and engaging in land redistribution, which was, a real no-no for conservative. I mean, quite how he was received in high society doing all these things is one of those questions you're bound to ask yourself as a historian. And of course, by that stage in his life, he was getting increasingly isolated. And the story I tell in the book of The Mistress and the flight abroad and all the rest of it, I think was partly of him being frozen out of high society, perhaps. One would want to do more research to find that out. I never really got as far as that. But I do think he paid a price socially.
He was certainly the black sheep in his own family. As you say, his wife and his children didn't approve of his politics.
No, well, that may have been because of his dalliances.
Yeah.
Are you sure, or I felt that in the talk that you felt that Kenneth Graham was criticising Toad in a sense, but I feel there's a lot of affection for him. I mean, we grew up with Winter the Willows. Dad actually read it at Christmas last year or year before. But I love Toad, and I think actually Kenneth Graham portrays that. I think there's a lot of affection there as well. I don't know if the room agrees, but
I was going to say exactly the same.
Yeah.
Toad is a very sympathetic character by Kenneth Graham. You plainly likes him, and there are times when Toad is saying, "Oh, forgive me, Ratty, for this," and there's tremendous charm.
Yeah. So, but for my way of looking at it, it's a book that has a message for different audiences, if you like. And Mr. Toad is a sympathetic character, but that's what you'd expect if you were going to try to do what Kenneth Graham was doing, which was, I think, to put into words a very, very bitter picture of contemporary life. And my feeling about Mr. Toad is that he's an artful creation. You love him, of course you do, but then you go on beyond, or perhaps you don't really. You never perhaps really go on beyond it. But what you're seeing is Kenneth Graham's own musings on his own time, when things were going to hell in a handcart. Rich people were betraying their own class, and the whole thing was falling apart. That's essentially what Toad's up to. He instead of behaving like a grand landowner, he swaggers around, making life extremely difficult for the ordinary people who depend on an orderly society. He's motoring. He's letting the weasels occupy Hardwick House. There's a great big land grab going on there, which they have to sort out by military action in the end, as you probably remember. So it seems to me a much deeper tale, if I can put it that way, than you might think, and that doesn't take away any of the pleasure of it.
No.
You know, I really wouldn't for a minute deny that Toad is a fantastic character and a very sympathetic character. And that's all part of the point.
Who are the stoats or weasels? I think you said. I thought they were stoats, but anyway, in the story, because they're definitely wicked,
Yes,
aren't they?
yes, they
in
are.
the story.
Yes. Well, in my reading of it, this is the left wing tendency in British society of the day. This is the Liberal Party which had taken power, taken it away from the Conservatives who rightly should have had it, and were putting through a radical programme. In the Liberal Party's programme from 1906 to 1915 was a very, very radical change in the direction of British society. And land taxation was a huge thing, the abolition of the House of Lords, a huge thing. Charles Rose was all in favour of that, astonishingly in some ways.
Did he have any opinions on equal rights? Did he write anything about rights for women?
No, he didn't. No.
The washerwoman scene.
Yes.
Yeah. Then there's a school of thought that Wind in the Willows is a sort of very gay book because there are no women whatsoever. And, I remember a friend of ours who's a writer sort of absolutely dismissing Wind in the Willows as a sort of quintessential,
There is a that it's a homoerotic fantasy of a life without the obligations of wives and children and that kind of thing, and just to have Rolly and Ratty sort of maybe I did read that it was more something about Toad being the sort of industrialist parvenu that comes and unsettles the kind of righteous harmony of the aristocratic.
Well, that's what I'm getting. I mean, there are lots of different ways of saying it, and it's been analysed in different ways by different writers. But that's basically where I'm coming from. And if you Kenneth Graham's papers are all in the Bodleian, you can go and have a look at them, and it's really, really interesting. I mean, Kenneth Graham gave the proceeds of Wind in the Willows to the Bodleian, and to this day it's still an enormous earner for the Bodleian. I mean, all the copyright payments, we had to make a copyright payment to use the image on the front of the book, but it all goes to the Bodleian in the end.
Good cause.
Good cause.
I wonder whether he ever knew, as everybody did in those days, Rudyard Kipling.
Yes.
Who was extremely politically active during this same period,
Yes.
but was very reactionary indeed, but was also a huge enthusiast for early motoring and indeed flying.
Yes.
And he's just about 20 years behind Charles Rose.
Yeah.
But he was also involved in the setting up of the Royal Automobile, the RAC, and also the very first organisation for flying, which I can't remember what it was called, but the Royal Aeronautical Society, I think.
Yeah.
They must have at least
Yes.
known of each other.
I,
He was
I
deeply
came,
reactionary.
I came across absolutely no trace of Rudyard Kipling in the Rose box.
But it's also worth saying that one of the reasons that what Michael wrote ended up being a booklet and not a book is that there are very few of Charles's papers left. All we have is a trunk of letters. A lot was destroyed, and why, we don't exactly know, but that you can cast aspersions that because of his known affairs and the fact that the evidence seems to suggest he was about to elope, that maybe the family burned or got rid of a certain amount of papers, and all the papers from Rosemorton Bank, and so all we have is the letters written that he wrote to his sons when they were on colonial service, which give away a certain amount, and then a few scrapbooks. Other than that, the lot has been lost, and so there would be an awful lot more evidence, and enough for a book, if we had more of that.
I mean, as a historian, sort of who gets used to these types of things, I would say they were destroyed by his widow, really as an act of expunging him from the life of the family. What survives are printed things, and they're very valuable because they were Charles Rose's scrapbooks. What he did was he employed a newspaper clippings agency, and any reference to him got clipped and put into a book. So that survived because no one could see how those were personal in a funny way. But all the personal side of his correspondence, the children have all survived. So you've even got their school reports from Eton. Sort of every one of them is there. But sort of when you try to get out into the life that he and Lily Rose had together, you know, you get absolutely nowhere. It's as though the whole thing has just been scrabbled up and put in a bin. So I think that's the pattern, to be honest. And you're quite right. I mean, he would be, I think, a major figure in the political history of the time if anyone could get closer to him and tell the story in its rounded qualities, because he's such an interesting character.
I must read Wind and Willow again, because I first read it in the early 50s, a long time ago, and I'm surprised a young person like you are reading the book now.
You can always get the film.
I shall reread it very soon. And thank you very much, Miriam, for inviting me. And it also shows a good book has relevance, whatever your age. Doesn't matter if I'm in my 80s or in my 20s.
Sure, let's go.
Right, should we maybe call it a day, do you think? I'm sure Michael will hang around for a bit if you would like to talk more. I should mention that as well as the books being on sale at the back, there are also some fantastic prints by Nick Hayes, who's sitting there, who of Hardwick, lovely pictures of Hardwick for sale as well, so have a look at the desk there. And another big thank you to Michael, and thank you to all of you for making it out.